I don't think so. Yet short of screaming in front of the assistant warden and all the witnesses for Jack Van Hay not to pull the switch, there was nothing I could do. Given another 5 seconds, I think I might have screamed just that, but Percy didn't give me another 5 seconds. "May God have mercy on your soul," he told the panting, terrified figure in the electric chair, then looked past him at the mesh-covered rectangle where Harry and Jack were standing, Jack with his hand on the switch marked Mabel's hair-dryer. The doctor was standing to the right of that window, eyes fixed on the black bag between his feet, as silent and self-effacing as ever. "Roll on, too." At first it was the same as always. The humming that was a little louder than the original cycle-up, but not much, and the mindless forward surge of Dell's body as his muscles spasmed. Then things started going wrong. The humming lost its steadiness and began to waver. It was joined by a crackling sound, like cellophane being crinkled. I could smell something horrible that I didn't identify as a mixture of burning hair and organic sponge until I saw blue tendrils of smoke curling out from beneath the edges of the cap. More smoke was streaming out of the hole in the top of the cap that the wire came in through. It looked like smoke coming out of the hole in an Indian's teepee. Delacroix began to jitter and twist in the chair, his mask-covered face snapping from side to side as if in some vehement refusal. His legs began to piston up and down in short strokes that were hampered by the clamps on his ankles. Thunder banged overhead, and now the rain began to pour down harder. I looked at Dean Stanton. He stared wildly back. There was a muffled pop from under the cap, like a pine knot exploding in a hot fire, and now I could see smoke coming through the mask as well, seeping out in little curls. I lunged toward the mesh between us and the switch room, but before I could open my mouth, Brutus Howell seized my elbow. His grip was hard enough to make the nerves in there tingle. He was as white as tallow, but not in a panic, not even close to being in a panic. "Don't you tell Jack to stop," he said in a low voice. "Whatever you do, don't tell him that. It's too late to stop." At first, when Dell began to scream, the witnesses didn't hear him. The rain on the tin roof had swelled to a roar, and the thunder was damn near continuous. But those of us on the platform heard him all right. Choked howls of pain from beneath the smoking mask, sounds an animal caught and mangled in a hay baler might make. The hum from the cap was ragged and wild now, broken by bursts of what sounded like radio static. Delacroix began to slam back and forth in the chair like a kid doing a tantrum. The platform shook, and he hit the leather restraining belt almost hard enough to pop it. The current was also twisting him from side to side, and I heard the crunching snap as his right shoulder either broke or dislocated. It went with a sound like someone hitting a wooden crate with a sledgehammer. The crotch of his pants, no more than a blur because of the short pistoning strokes of his legs, darkened. Then he began to squeal, horrible sounds, high-pitched and rat-like, that were audible even over the rushing downpour. "What the hell's happening to him?" someone cried. "Are those clamps going to hold? Christ, the smell! Phew!" Then one of the two women, "Is this normal?" Delacroix snapped forward, dropped back, snapped forward, fell back. Percy was staring at him with slack-jawed horror. He had expected something, sure, but not this. The mask burst into flame on Delacroix's face. The smell of cooking hair and sponge was now joined by the smell of cooking flesh. Brutal grabbed the bucket the sponge had been in, it was empty now, of course, and charged for the extra-deep janitor sink in the corner. "Shouldn't I kill the juice, Paul?" Van Hay called through the mesh. He sounded completely rattled. "Shouldn't I?" "No!" I shouted back. Brutal had understood it first, but I hadn't been far behind. We had to finish it. Whatever else we might do in all the rest of our lives was secondary to that one thing. We had to finish with Delacroix. "Roll, for Christ's sake! Roll, roll, roll!" I turned to Brutal, hardly aware of the people talking behind us now, some on their feet, a couple screaming. "Quit that!" I yelled at Brutal. "No water! No water! Are you nuts?" Brutal turned toward me, a kind of dazed understanding on his face. Throw water on a man who was getting the juice. Oh, yes, that would be very smart. He looked around, saw the chemical fire extinguisher hanging on the wall, and got that instead. Good boy. The mask had peeled away from Delacroix's face, enough to reveal features that had gone blacker than John Coffey's. His eyes, now nothing but misshapen globs of white, filmy jelly, had been blown out of their sockets and lay on his cheeks. His eyelashes were gone, and as I looked, the lids themselves caught fire and began to burn. Smoke puffed from the open V of his shirt, and then that too caught fire. And still the humming of the electricity went on, filling my head, vibrating in there. I think it's the sound mad people must hear, that or something like it. Dean started forward, thinking in some dazed way that he could beat the fire out of Dell's shirt with his hands, and I yanked him away almost hard enough to pull him off his feet. Touching Delacroix at that point would have been like Brer Rabbit punching into the tar baby, an electrified tar baby in this case. I still didn't turn around to see what was going on behind us, but it sounded like pandemonium, chairs falling over, people bellowing, a woman crying, "Stop it! Stop it! Oh, can't you see he's had enough?" at the top of her lungs. Curtis Anderson grabbed my shoulder and asked what was happening, for Christ's sake what was happening, and why didn't I order Jack to shut down? "Because I can't," I said. "We've gone too far to turn back, can't you see that? It'll be over in a few more seconds anyway." But it was at least 2 minutes before it was over. The longest 2 minutes of my whole life. And through most of it I think Delacroix was conscious. He screamed and jittered and rocked from side to side. Smoke poured from his nostrils and from a mouth that had gone the purple-black of ripe plums. Smoke drifted up from his tongue the way smoke rises from a hot griddle. All the buttons on his shirt either burst or melted. His undershirt did not quite catch fire, but it charred, and smoke poured through it, and we could smell his chest hair roasting. Behind us, people were heading for the door like cattle in a stampede. They couldn't get out through it, of course. We were in a damn prison, after all, so they simply clustered around it while Delacroix fried. "Now I'm fryin'," old Toot had said when we were rehearsing for Arlen Bitterbuck. "I'm a done Tom Turkey." And the thunder rolled, and the rain ran down out of the sky in a perfect fury. At some point I thought of the doc and looked around for him. He was still there, but crumpled on the floor beside his black bag. He'd fainted. Brutal came up and stood beside me, holding the fire extinguisher. "Not yet," I said. "I know." We looked around for Percy, and saw him standing almost behind Sparky now, frozen, eyes huge, one knuckle crammed into his mouth. Then, at last, Delacroix slumped back in the chair, his bulging, misshapen face lying over on one shoulder. He was still jittering, but we'd seen this before. It was the current running through him. The cap had come askew on his head, but when we took it off a little later, most of his scalp and his remaining fringe of hair came with it, bonded to the metal as if by some powerful adhesive. "Kill it," I called to Jack when 30 seconds had gone by, with nothing but electric jitters coming from the smoking, man-shaped lump of charcoal lolling in the electric chair. The hum died immediately, and I nodded to Brutal. He turned and slammed the fire extinguisher into Percy's arm so hard that Percy staggered backward and almost fell off the platform. "You do it," Brutal said. "You're running the show, after all, ain't you?" Percy gave him a look that was both sick and murderous, then armed the extinguisher, pumped it, cocked it, and shot a huge cloud of white foam over the man in the chair. I saw Dell's foot twitch once as the spray hit his face and thought, oh no, we might have to go again, but there was only that single twitch. Anderson had turned around and was bawling at the panicky witnesses, telling them everything was all right, everything was under control, just a power surge from the electrical storm, nothing to worry about. Next thing, he'd be telling them that what they smelled, a devil's mixture of burned hair, fried meat, and fresh-baked shit right out of Edouard Delacroix's crispy asshole, was Chanel No. 5. "Get Doc's stethoscope," I told Dean as the extinguisher ran dry. Delacroix was coated with white now, and the worst of the stench was being overlaid by a thin and bitter chemical smell. "Doc, should I—" "Never mind, Doc. Just get his stethoscope," I said. "Let's get this over. Get him out of here." Dean nodded. Over and out of here were two concepts that appealed to him just then. They appealed to both of us. He went over to Doc's bag and began rummaging in it. Doc was beginning to move again, so at least he hadn't had a stroke or a heart storm. That was good. But the way Brutal was looking at Percy wasn't. "Get down in the tunnel and wait by the gurney," I said. Percy swallowed. "Paul, listen, I didn't know—" "Shut up. Get down in the tunnel and wait by the gurney. Now." He swallowed, grimaced as if it hurt, and then walked toward the door which led to the stairs and the tunnel. He carried the empty fire extinguisher in his arms as if it were a baby. Dean passed him, coming back to me with the stethoscope. I snatched it and set the earpieces. I'd done this before in the army, and it's sort of like riding a bike. You don't forget. I wiped at the foam on Delacroix's chest, then had to gag back vomit as a large, hot section of his skin simply slid away from the flesh beneath, the way the skin will slide off well, you know, a done tom turkey. "Oh, my God!" A voice I didn't recognize almost sobbed behind me. "Is it always this way? Why didn't somebody tell me? I never would have come." Too late now, friend, I thought. "Get that man out of here," I said to Dean, or Brutal, or whoever might be listening. I said it when I was sure I could speak without puking into Delacroix's smoking lap. "Get 'em all back by the door." I steeled myself as best I could, then put the disc of the stethoscope on the red-black patch of raw flesh I'd made on Dell's chest. I listened, praying I would hear nothing, and that's just what I did hear. "He's dead," I told Brutal. "Thank Christ." "Yes, thank Christ. You and Dean get the stretcher. Let's unbuckle him and get him out of here fast." Chapter 5. We got his body down the 12 stairs and onto the gurney all right. My nightmare was that his cooked flesh might slough right off his bones as we lugged him. It was old Toots' done tom turkey that had gotten into my head. But, of course, that didn't happen. Curtis Anderson was upstairs soothing the spectators, trying to, anyway, and that was good for Brutal, because Anderson wasn't there to see when Brutal took a step toward the head of the gurney and pulled his arm back to slug Percy, who was standing there looking stunned. I caught his arm, and that was good for both of them. It was good for Percy because Brutal meant to deliver a blow of near-decapitory force, and good for Brutal because he would have lost his job if the blow had connected, and maybe ended up in prison himself. "No," I said. "What do you mean, no?" he asked me furiously. "How can you say no? You saw what he did. What are you telling me, that you're still going to let his connections protect him after what he did?" "Yes." Brutal stared at me, mouth agape, eyes so angry they were watering. "Listen to me, Brutus. You take a poke at him, and most likely we all go. You, me, Dean, Harry, maybe even Jack Van Hay. Everyone else moves a rung or two up the ladder, starting with Bill Dodge, and the prison commission hires 3 or 4 breadline Barneys to fill the spots at the bottom. Maybe you can live with that, but—" I cocked my thumb at Dean, who was staring down the dripping, brick-lined tunnel. He was holding his specs in one hand and looked almost as dazed as Percy. "But what about Dean? He's got 2 kids, one in high school and one just about to go." "So what's it come down to?" Brutal asked. "We let him get away with it?" "I didn't know the sponge was supposed to be wet," Percy said in a faint, mechanical voice. This was the story he had rehearsed beforehand, of course, when he was expecting a painful prank instead of the cataclysm we had just witnessed. "It was never wet when we rehearsed." "Ah, you sucker," Brutal began and started for Percy. I grabbed him again and yanked him back. Footsteps clacked on the steps. I looked up, desperately afraid of seeing Curtis Anderson, but it was Harry Terwilliger. His cheeks were paper white, and his lips were purplish, as if he'd been eating blackberry cobbler. I switched my attention back to Brutal. "For God's sake, Brutal, Delacroix's dead. Nothing can change that, and Percy's not worth it." Was the plan, or the beginnings of it, in my head even then? I've wondered about that since, let me tell you. I've wondered over the course of a lot of years, and have never been able to come up with a satisfactory answer. I suppose it doesn't matter much. A lot of things don't matter, but it doesn't keep a man from wondering about them, I've noticed. "You guys talk about me like I was a chump," Percy said. He still sounded dazed and winded, as if someone had punched him deep in the gut, but he was coming back a little. "You are a chump, Percy," I said. "Hey, you can't—" I controlled my own urge to hit him, only with the greatest effort. Water dripped hollowly from the bricks down in the tunnel. Our shadows danced huge and misshapen on the walls, like shadows in that Poe story about the big ape in the Rue Morgue. Thunder bashed, but down here it was muffled. "I only want to hear one thing from you, Percy, and that's you repeating your promise to put in for Briar Ridge tomorrow." "Don't worry about that," he said sullenly. He looked at the sheeted figure on the gurney, looked away, flicked his eyes up toward my face for a moment, then looked away again. "That would be for the best," Harry said. "Otherwise you might get to know Wild Bill Wharton a whole lot better'n you want to." A slight pause. "We could see to it." Percy was afraid of us, and he was probably afraid of what we might do if he was still around when we found out he'd been talking to Jack Van Hay about what the sponge was for and why we always soaked it in brine, but Harry's mention of Wharton woke real terror in his eyes. I could see him remembering how Wharton had held him, ruffling his hair and crooning to him. "You wouldn't dare," Percy whispered. "Yes, I would," Harry replied calmly. "And do you know what? I'd get away with it. Because you've already shown yourself to be careless as hell around the prisoners. Incompetent, too." Percy's fists bunched and his cheeks colored in a thin pink. "I am not sure you are," Dean said, joining us. We formed a rough semicircle around Percy at the foot of the stairs, and even a retreat up the tunnel was blocked. The gurney was behind him, with its load of smoking flesh hidden under an old sheet. "You just burned Delacroix alive. If that ain't incompetent, what is?" Percy's eyes flickered. He had been planning to cover himself by pleading ignorance, and now he saw he was hoist by his own petard. I don't know what he might have said next, because Curtis Anderson came lunging down the stairs just then. We heard him and drew back from Percy a little so as not to look quite so threatening. "What in the blue fuck was that all about?" Anderson roared. "Jesus Christ! There's puke all over the floor up there. And the smell! I got Magnuson and old Toot-Toot to open both doors, but that smell won't come out for 5 damn years, that's what I'm betting. And that asshole Wharton is singing about it. I can hear him." "Can he carry a tune, Kurt?" Brutal asked. "You know how you can burn off illuminating gas with a single spark and not be hurt if you do it before the concentration gets too heavy? This was like that. We took an instant to gape at Brutus, and then we were all howling. Our high, hysterical laughter flapped up and down the gloomy tunnel like bats. Our shadows bobbed and flickered on the walls. Near the end, even Percy joined in. At last it died, and in its aftermath we all felt a little better. Felt sane again. "Okay, boys," Anderson said, mopping at his teary eyes with his handkerchief and still snorting out an occasional hiccup of laughter. "What the hell happened?" "An execution," Brutal said. I think his even tone surprised Anderson, but it didn't surprise me, at least not much. Brutal had always been good at turning down his dials in a hurry. A successful one. "How in the name of Christ can you call a direct current abortion like that a success? We've got witnesses that won't sleep for a month. Hell, that fat old broad probably won't sleep for a year." Brutal pointed at the gurney and the shape under the sheet. "He's dead, ain't he? As for your witnesses, most of them will be telling their friends tomorrow night that it was poetic justice. Dell there burned a bunch of people alive, so we turn around and burn him alive. Except they won't say it was us. They'll say it was the will of God working through us. Maybe there's even some truth to that. And you want to know the best part? The absolute cat's pajamas? Most of their friends will wish they'd been here to see it." He gave Percy a look both distasteful and sardonic as he said this last. "And if their feathers are a little ruffled, so what?" Harry asked. "They volunteered for the damn job. Nobody drafted them." "I didn't know the sponge was supposed to be wet," Percy said in his robot's voice. "It's never wet in rehearsal." Dean looked at him with utter disgust. "How many years did you spend pissing on the toilet seat before someone told you to put it up before you start?" he snarled. Percy opened his mouth to reply, but I told him to shut up. For a wonder, he did. I turned to Anderson. "Percy fucked up, Curtis. That's what happened, pure and simple." I turned toward Percy, daring him to contradict me. He didn't. Maybe because he read my eyes. Better that Anderson hear stupid mistake than on purpose. And besides, whatever was said down here in the tunnel didn't matter. What mattered, what always matters to the Percy Wetmores of the world, is what gets written down or overheard by the big bugs, the people who matter. Anderson looked at the five of us uncertainly. He even looked at Dell, but Dell wasn't talking. "I guess it could be worse," Anderson said. "That's right," I agreed. "He could still be alive." Curtis blinked. That possibility seemed not to have crossed his mind. "I want a complete report about this on my desk tomorrow," he said. "And none of you are going to talk to Warden Moores about it until I've had my chance. Are you?" We shook our heads vehemently. If Curtis Anderson wanted to tell the warden, why, that was fine by us. "If none of those asshole scribblers put it in their papers, they won't," I said. "If they tried, their editors would kill it. Too gruesome for a family audience, but they won't even try. They were all vets tonight. Sometimes things go wrong, that's all. They know it as well as we do." Anderson considered a moment longer, then nodded. He turned his attention to Percy, an expression of disgust on his usually pleasant face. "You're a little asshole," he said, "and I don't like you a bit." He nodded at Percy's look of flabbergasted surprise. "If you tell any of your candy-ass friends I said that, I'll deny it until Aunt Rhodey's old gray goose comes back to life, and these men will back me up. You got a problem, son." He turned and started up the stairs. I let him get 4 steps and then said, "Curtis?" He turned back, eyebrows raised, saying nothing. "You don't want to worry too much about Percy," I said. "He's moving on to Briar Ridge soon. Bigger and better things, isn't that right, Percy?" "As soon as his transfer comes through," Brutal added. "And until it comes, he's going to call in sick every night," Dean put in. That roused Percy, who hadn't been working at the prison long enough to have accumulated more than a few days' paid sick time. He looked at Dean with bright distaste. "Don't you wish?" he said. Chapter 6. We were back on the block by 1:15 or so, except for Percy, who had been ordered to clean up the storage room and was sulking his way through the job. Me with a report to write. I decided to do it at the duty desk. If I sat in my more comfortable office chair, I'd likely doze off. That probably sounds peculiar to you, given what had happened only an hour before, but I felt as if I'd lived 3 lifetimes since 11 o'clock the previous night, all of them without sleep. John Coffey was standing at his cell door, tears streaming from his strange, distant eyes. It was like watching blood run out of some unhealable but strangely painless wound. Closer to the desk, Wharton was sitting on his bunk, rocking from side to side and singing a song apparently of his own invention and not quite nonsense. As well as I can remember, it went something like this. "Barbecue me and you, stinky, pinky, phew, phew, phew. It wasn't Billy or Philadelphia Philly, it wasn't Jackie or Roy. It was a warm little number, a hot cucumber by the name of Delacroix." "Shut up, you jerk," I said. Wharton grinned, showing his mouthful of dying teeth. He wasn't dying, at least not yet. He was up, happy, practically tap dancing. "Come on in here and make me, why don't you?" he said happily, and then began another verse of the barbecue song, making up words not quite at random. There was something going on in there, all right. A kind of green and stinking intelligence that was, in its own way, almost brilliant. I went down to John Coffey. He wiped away his tears with the heels of his hands. His eyes were red and sore-looking, and it came to me that he was exhausted, too. Why he should have been, a man who trudged around the exercise yard maybe 2 hours a day and either sat or laid down in his cell the rest of the time, I didn't know. But I didn't doubt what I was seeing. It was too clear. "Poor Dell," he said in a low, hoarse voice. "Poor old Dell." "Yes," I said. "Poor old Dell." "John, are you okay?" "He's out of it," Coffey said. "Dell's out of it, isn't he, boss?" "Yes. Answer my question, John. Are you okay?" "Dell's out of it. He's the lucky one. No matter how it happened, he's the lucky one." I thought Delacroix might have given him an argument on that, but didn't say so. I glanced around Coffey's cell instead. "Where's Mr. Jingles?" "Ran down there." He pointed through the bars down the hall to the restraint room door. I nodded. Well, he'll be back. But he wasn't. Mr. Jingles' days on the Green Mile were over. The only trace of him we ever happened on was what Brutal found that winter, a few brightly colored splinters of wood and a smell of peppermint candy wafting out of a hole in a beam. I meant to walk away then, but I didn't. I looked at John Coffey, and he back at me as if he knew everything I was thinking. I told myself to get moving, to just call it a night and get moving, back to the duty desk and my report. Instead, I said his name. "John Coffey." "Yes, boss," he said at once. Sometimes a man is cursed with needing to know a thing, and that was how it was with me right then. I dropped down on one knee and began taking off one of my shoes. Chapter 7. The rain had quit by the time I got home, and a late grin of moon had appeared over the ridges to the north. My sleepiness seemed to have gone with the clouds. I was wide awake, and I could smell Delacroix on me. I thought I might smell him on my skin. Barbecue, me and you, stinky pinky, phew, phew, phew. For a long time to come. Janice was waiting up, as she always did on execution nights. I meant not to tell her the story, saw no sense in harrowing her with it. But she got a clear look at my face as I came in the kitchen door, and would have it all. So I sat down, took her warm hands in my cold ones. The heater in my old Ford barely worked, and the weather had turned 180 degrees since the storm, and told her what she thought she wanted to hear. About halfway through, I broke down crying, which I hadn't expected. I was a little ashamed, but only a little. It was her, you see, and she never taxed me with the times that I slipped from the way I thought a man should be. The way I thought I should be, at any rate. A man with a good wife is the luckiest of God's creatures, and one without must be among the most miserable, I think, the only true blessing of their lives that they don't know how poorly off they are. I cried, and she held my head against her breast, and when my own storm passed, I felt better. A little, anyway. And I believe that was when I had the first conscious sight of my idea. Not the shoe. I don't mean that. The shoe was related, but different. All my real idea was, right then, however, was an odd realization. That John Coffey and Melinda Moores different as they might have been in size and sex and color, had exactly the same eyes, woeful, sad, and distant, dying eyes. "Come to bed," my wife said at last. "Come to bed with me, Paul." So I did, and we made love. And when it was over, she went to sleep. As I lay there, watching the moon grin and listening to the walls tick, they were at last pulling in, exchanging summer for fall, I thought about John Coffey saying he had helped it. "I helped Dell's mouse. I helped Mr. Jingles. He's a circus mouse." Sure. And maybe I thought we were all circus mice, running around with only the dimmest awareness that God and all his heavenly host were watching us in our bakelite houses through our ivy glass windows. I slept a little as the day began to lighten. 2 hours, I guess, maybe 3, and I slept the way I always sleep these days here at Georgia Pines, and hardly ever did then, in thin little licks. What I went to sleep thinking about was the churches of my youth. The names changed, depending on the whims of my mother and her sisters, but they were all really the same, all the First Backwoods Church of Praise Jesus the Lord is Mighty. In the shadow of those blunt square steeples, the concept of atonement came up as regularly as the toll of the bell which called the faithful to worship. Only God could forgive sins, could and did, washing them away in the agonal blood of his crucified Son, but that did not change the responsibility of his children to atone for those sins and even their simple errors of judgment whenever possible. Atonement was powerful. It was the lock on the door you closed against the past. I fell asleep, thinking of Piney Wood's atonement, and Edouard Delacroix on fire as he rode the lightning, and Melinda Moore's, and my big boy with the endlessly weeping eyes. These thoughts twisted their way into a dream. In it, John Coffey was sitting on a riverbank and bawling his inarticulate mooncalf's grief up at the early summer sky, while on the other bank a freight train stormed endlessly toward a rusty trestle spanning the Trapingus. In the crook of each arm, the black man held the body of a naked, blonde-haired girl-child. His fists, huge brown rocks at the ends of those arms, were closed. All around him crickets chirred, and no-see-ums flocked. The day hummed with heat. In my dream, I went to him, knelt before him, and took his hands. His fists relaxed, and gave up their secrets. In one was a spool, colored green and red and yellow. In the other was a prison guard's shoe. "I couldn't help it," John Coffey said. "I tried to take it back, but it was too late." And this time, in my dream, I understood him. Chapter 8. At 9 o'clock the next morning, while I was having a third cup of coffee on the porch, my wife said nothing, but I could see disapproval writ large on her face when she brought it to me. The telephone rang. I went into the parlor to take it, and Central told someone that their party was holding the line. She then told me to have a birdlarky day and rang off, presumably. With Central, you could never quite tell for sure. Hal Moore's voice shocked me. Wavery and hoarse, it sounded like the voice of an octogenarian. It occurred to me that it was good that things had gone all right with Curtis Anderson in the tunnel last night, good that he felt about the same as we did about Percy, because this man I was talking to would very likely never work another day at Cold Mountain. "Paul, I understand there was trouble last night. I also understand that our friend Mr. Wetmore was involved." "A spot of trouble?" I admitted, holding the receiver tight to my ear and leaning in toward the horn. But the job got done, that's the important thing. Yes, of course. Can I ask who told you? So I can tie a can to his tail, I didn't add. You can ask, but since it's really none of your beeswax, I think I'll keep my mouth shut on that score. But when I called my office to see if there were any messages or urgent business, I was told an interesting thing. Oh? Yes. Seems a transferal application landed in my basket. Percy Wetmore wants to go to Briar Ridge as soon as possible. Must have filled out the application even before last night's shift was over, wouldn't you think? It sounds that way, I agreed. Ordinarily, I'd let Curtis handle it, but considering the atmosphere on E-Block just lately, I asked Hannah to run it over to me personally on her lunch hour. She has graciously agreed to do so. I'll approve it and see it's forwarded on to the state capitol this afternoon. I expect you'll get a look at Percy's backside going out the door in no more than a month, maybe less. He expected me to be pleased with this news, and had a right to expect it. He had taken time out from tending his wife to expedite a matter that might otherwise have taken upwards of half a year, even with Percy's vaunted connections. Nevertheless, my heart sank. A month. But maybe it didn't matter much, one way or the other. It removed a perfectly natural desire to wait and put off a risky endeavor, and what I was now thinking about would be very risky indeed. Sometimes, when that's the case, it's better to jump before you can lose your nerve. If we were going to have to deal with Percy in any case, always assuming I could get the others to go along with my insanity, always assuming there was a we, in other words, it might as well be tonight. Paul? Are you there? His voice lowered a little, as if he thought he was now talking to himself. Damn, I think I lost the connection. No, I'm here, Al. That's great news. Yes, he agreed, and I was again struck by how old he sounded, how papery somehow. Oh, I know what you're thinking. No, you don't, Warden, I thought. Never in a million years could you know what I'm thinking. You're thinking that our young friend will still be around for the coffee execution. That's probably true. Coffee will go well before Thanksgiving, I imagine. But you can put him back in the switch room. No one will object, including him, I should think. I'll do that, I said. How's Melinda? There was a long pause, so long I might have thought I'd lost him, except for the sound of his breathing. When he spoke this time, it was in a much lower tone of voice. She's sinking, he said. Sinking. That chilly word the old-timers used, not to describe a person who was dying, exactly, but one who had begun to uncouple from living. The headaches seem a little better, for now, anyway, but she can't walk without help, she can't pick things up, she loses control of her water while she sleeps. There was another pause, and then in an even lower voice Hal said something that sounded like, she wears. Wears what, Hal? I asked, frowning. My wife had come into the parlor doorway. She stood there wiping her hands on a dish towel and looking at me. No, he said, in a voice that seemed to waver between anger and tears. She swears. Oh. I still didn't know what he meant, but had no intention of pursuing it. I didn't have to. He did it for me. She'll be all right. Perfectly normal, talking about her flower garden, or a dress she saw in the catalog, or maybe about how she heard Roosevelt on the radio and how wonderful he sounds. And then all at once she'll start to say the most awful things, the most awful words. She doesn't raise her voice. It would almost be better if she did, I think, because then, you see, then she wouldn't sound so much like herself. That's it, he said gratefully. But to hear her saying those awful gutter-language things in her sweet voice— "Pardon me, Paul." His voice trailed away, and I heard him noisily clearing his throat. Then he came back, sounding a little stronger, but just as distressed. "She wants to have Pastor Donaldson over, and I know he's a comfort to her, but how can I ask him? Suppose that he's sitting there reading scripture with her, and she calls him a foul name. She could. She called me one last night. She said, 'Hand me that Liberty magazine, you cocksucker, would you?' Paul, where could she have ever heard such language? How could she know those words?" "I don't know. Hal, are you going to be home this evening?" When he was well and in charge of himself, not distracted by worry or grief, Hal Moores had a cutting and sarcastic facet to his personality. His subordinates feared that side of him even more than his anger or his contempt, I think. His sarcasm, usually impatient and often harsh, could sting like acid. A little of that now splashed on me. It was unexpected, but on the whole I was glad to hear it. All the fight hadn't gone out of him after all, it seemed. "No," he said, "I'm taking Melinda out square dancing. We're going to do-si-do, Alamand left, and then tell the fiddler he's a rooster-dig motherfucker." I clapped my hand over my mouth to keep from laughing. Mercifully, it was an urge that passed in a hurry. "I'm sorry," he said. "I haven't been getting much sleep lately. It's made me grouchy. Of course we're going to be home. Why do you ask?" "It doesn't matter, I guess," I said. "You weren't thinking of coming by, were you? Because if you were on last night, you'll be on tonight, unless you've switched with somebody." "No, I haven't switched," I said. "I'm on tonight." "It wouldn't be a good idea anyway. Not the way she is right now." "Maybe not. Thanks for your news." "You're welcome. Pray for my Melinda, Paul." I said I would, thinking that I might do quite a bit more than pray. God helps those who help themselves, as they say in the Church of Praise Jesus, the Lord is Mighty. I hung up and looked at Janice. "How's Melly?" she asked. "Not good." I told her what Hal had told me, including the part about the swearing, although I left out cocksucker and rooster-dick motherfucker. I finished with Hal's word, sinking, and Jan nodded sadly. Then she took a closer look at me. "What are you thinking about?" "You're thinking about something, probably no good. It's in your face." Lying was out of the question. It wasn't the way we were with each other. I just told her it was best she not know, at least for the time being. Could it get you in trouble?" She didn't sound particularly alarmed at the idea, more interested than anything, which is one of the things I have always loved about her. "Maybe," I said. "Is it a good thing?" "Maybe," I repeated. I was standing there, still turning the phone's crank idly with one finger while I held down the connecting points with a finger of my other hand. "Would you like me to leave you alone while you use the telephone?" she asked. "Be a good little woman and butt out, do some dishes, knit some booties?" I nodded. That's not the way I'd put it, but are we having extras for lunch, Paul? "I hope so," I said. Chapter 9. I got Brutal and Dean right away because both of them were on the exchange. Harry wasn't, not then at least, but I had the number of his closest neighbor who was. Harry called me back about 20 minutes later, highly embarrassed at having to reverse the charges and sputtering promises to pay his share when our next bill came. I told him we'd count those chickens when they hatched. In the meantime, could he come over to my place for lunch? Brutal and Dean would be here, and Janice had promised to put out some of her famous slaw, not to mention her even more famous apple pie. Lunch just for the hell of it? Harry sounded skeptical. I admitted I had something I wanted to talk to them about, but it was best not gone into even lightly over the phone. Harry agreed to come. I dropped the receiver onto the prongs, went to the window, and looked out thoughtfully. Although we'd had the late shift, I hadn't awakened either Brutal or Dean, and Harry hadn't sounded like a fellow freshly turned out of dreamland either. It seemed that I wasn't the only one having problems with what had happened last night, and considering the craziness I had in mind, that was probably good. Brutal, who lived closest to me, arrived at 11:15. Dean showed up 15 minutes later, and Harry, already dressed for work, about 15 minutes after Dean. Janice served us cold beef sandwiches, slaw, and iced tea in the kitchen. Only a day before, we would have had it out on the side porch and been glad of a breeze, but the temperature had dropped a good 15 degrees since the thunderstorm, and a keen-edged wind was snuffling down from the ridges. "You're welcome to sit down with us," I told my wife. She shook her head. "I don't think I want to know what you're up to. I'll worry less if I'm in the dark. I'll have a bite in the parlor. I'm visiting with Miss Jane Austen this week, and she's very good company." "Who's Jane Austen?" Harry asked when she had left. "Your side or Janice's, Paul? A cousin? Is she pretty?" "She's a writer, you nit," Brutal told him. "Been dead practically since Betsy Ross basted the stars on the first flag." "Oh," Harry looked embarrassed. "I'm not much of a reader. Radio manuals mostly." "What's on your mind, Paul?" Dean asked. John Coffey and Mr. Jingles to start with. They looked surprised, which I had expected. They'd been thinking I wanted to discuss either Delacroix or Percy, maybe both. I looked at Dean and Harry. The thing with Mr. Jingles, what Coffey did, happened pretty fast. I don't know if he got there in time to see how broken up the mouse was or not. Dean shook his head. "I saw the blood on the floor, though." I turned to Brutal. "That son of a bitch Percy crushed it," he said simply. "It should have died, but it didn't. Coffey did something to it. Healed it somehow. I know how that sounds, but I saw it with my own eyes." I said, "He healed me as well. And I didn't just see it. I felt it." I told them about my urinary infection, how it had come back, how bad it had been. I pointed through the window at the woodpile I'd had to hold on to the morning the pain drove me to my knees, and how it had gone away completely after Coffey touched me, and stayed away. It didn't take long to tell. When I was done, they sat and thought about it a while, chewing on their sandwiches as they did. Then Dean said, "Black things came out of his mouth, like bugs." "That's right," Harry agreed. "They were black to start with, anyway. Then they turned white and disappeared." He looked around, considering. "It's like I damn near forgot the whole thing until you brought it up, Paul. Ain't that funny?" "Nothing funny or strange about it," Brutal said. "I think that's what people most always do with the stuff they can't make out. Just forget it. Doesn't do a person much good to remember stuff that doesn't make any sense." "What about it, Paul? Were there bugs when he fixed you?" "Yes. I think they're the sickness, the pain, the hurt. He takes it in, then lets it out into the open air again." "Where it dies," Harry said. I shrugged. I didn't know if it died or not, wasn't sure it even mattered. "Did he suck it out of you?" Brutal asked. "He looked like he was sucking it right out of the mouse. The hurt, the death." "No," I said. "He just touched me, and I felt it. A kind of jolt, like electricity, only not painful. But I wasn't dying, only hurting." Brutal nodded. "The touch and the breath. Just like you hear those backwoods gospel shouters going on about." "Praise Jesus, the Lord is mighty," I said. "I don't know if Jesus comes into it," Brutal said, "but it seems to me like John Coffey is one mighty man." "All right," Dean said. "If you say all this happened, I guess I believe it. God works in mysterious ways his wonders to perform. But what's it got to do with us?" Well, that was the big question, wasn't it? I took in a deep breath and told them what I wanted to do. They listened, dumbfounded. Even Brutal, who liked to read those magazines with the stories about little green men from space, looked dumbfounded. There was a longer silence when I finished this time, and no one chewing any sandwiches. At last, in a gentle and reasonable voice, Brutus Howell said, "We'd lose our jobs if we were caught, Paul, and we'd be very goddamn lucky if that was all that happened. We'd probably end up over in A Block as guests of the state, making wallets and showering in pairs." "Yes," I said, "that could happen." "I can understand how you feel, a little," he went on. "You know Moore's better than us. He's your friend as well as the big boss, and I know you think a lot of his wife." "She's the sweetest woman you could ever hope to meet," I said, "and she means the world to him." "But we don't know her the way you and Janice do," Brutal said. "Do we, Paul?" "You'd like her if you did," I said. "At least you'd like her if you'd met her before this thing got its claws into her. She does a lot of community things. She's a good friend, and she's religious. More than that, she's funny. Used to be, anyhow. She could tell you things that'd make you laugh until the tears rolled down your cheeks. But none of those things are the reason I want to help save her, if she can be saved. What's happening to her is an offense, God damn it, an offense, to the eyes and the ears and the heart. Very noble. But I doubt like hell if that's what put this bee in your bonnet," Brutal said. "I think it's what happened to Dell. You want to balance it off somehow." And he was right. Of course he was. I knew Melinda Moores better than the others did, but maybe not, in the end, well enough to ask them to risk their jobs for her, and possibly their freedom as well. Or my own job and freedom, for that matter. I had 2 grown children, and the last thing on God's earth that I wanted my wife to have to do was to write them the news that their father was going on trial for, well, what would it be? I didn't know for sure. Aiding and abetting an escape attempt seemed the most likely. But the death of Edouard Delacroix had been the ugliest, foulest thing I had ever seen in my life. Not just my working life, but my whole entire life, and I had been a party to it. We had all been a party to it, because we had allowed Percy Wetmore to stay even after we knew he was horribly unfit to work in a place like E Block. We had played the game. Even Warden Moores had been a party to it. His nuts are going to cook whether Wetmore's on the team or not, he had said, and maybe that was well enough considering what the little Frenchman had done. But in the end, Percy had done a lot more than cook Dell's nuts. He had blown the little man's eyeballs right out of their sockets and set his damned face on fire. And why? Because Dell was a murderer half a dozen times over? No. Because Percy had wet his pants, and the little Cajun had had the temerity to laugh at him. We'd been part of a monstrous act, and Percy was going to get away with it. Off to Briar Ridge he would go, happy as a clam at high tide, and there he would have a whole asylum filled with lunatics to practice his cruelties upon. There was nothing we could do about that, but perhaps it was not too late to wash some of the muck off our own hands. In my church they call it atonement instead of balancing, I said. But I guess it comes to the same thing. "Do you really think coffee could save her?" Dean asked in a soft, awed voice. "Just, what, suck that brain tumor out of her head like it was a peach pit?" "I think he could. It's not for sure, of course, but after what he did to me and to Mr. Jingles, that mouse was seriously busted up, all right," Brutal said. "But would he do it?" Harry mused. "Would he?" "If he can, he will," I said. "Why? Coffee doesn't even know her." "Because it's what he does. It's what God made him for." Brutal made a show of looking around, reminding us all that someone was missing. "What about Percy? You think he's just going to let this go down?" he asked. And so I told them what I had in mind for Percy. By the time I finished, Harry and Dean were looking at me in amazement, and a reluctant grin of admiration had dawned on Brutal's face. "Pretty audacious, Brother Paul," he said. "Fair takes my breath away. But wouldn't it be the bee's knees?" Dean almost whispered, then laughed aloud and clapped his hands like a child. "I mean vo-do-de-o-do and 23 skidoo!" You want to remember that Dean had a special interest in the part of my plan that involved Percy. Percy could have gotten Dean killed, after all, freezing up the way he had. "Yeah, but what about after?" Harry said. He sounded gloomy, but his eyes gave him away. They were sparkling, the eyes of a man who wants to be convinced. "What then?" "They say dead men tell no tales," Brutal rumbled, and I took a quick look at him to make sure he was joking. "I think he'll keep his mouth shut," I said. "Really?" Dean looked skeptical. He took off his glasses and began to polish them. "Convince me." "First, he won't know what really happened. He's going to